police officer purposely hits an elderly black woman in a crosswalk, unaware of what it would lead to. The consequences will prove shocking for everyone. Subscribe, watch to the end, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Mabel Jenkins stood by the window, looking out onto the quiet street of her neighborhood, a place she'd called home for over 50 years. The same stretch of road she'd walked countless times, the same corner store where she'd pick up milk and bread, the same familiar faces she'd come to think of as family. To some, it was just a humble neighborhood, full of old buildings and cracked sidewalks, but to Mabel, it was a sanctuary. Mabel was 72, her hair a cloud of silver curls, her frame small and a bit stooped, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to lend her height. Her neighbors knew her as the lady with the kind heart, always ready with a warm smile or a listening ear. She was the one people called when they needed advice or a little help, whether it was the young mother across the hall who was having trouble getting through the day, or the elderly man down the street who couldn't manage the stairs as well as he used to. That day, as she tied her scarf carefully around her neck, she felt a twinge of nostalgia. She remembered how she'd moved here with her husband when they were young and full of dreams. Though life hadn't been easy, especially after he passed away, this place had always given her a sense of belonging, even when the city around her changed. Mabel's gaze drifted to the street below, where she saw a group of kids playing on the sidewalk. They were the next generation of this community, a lively mix of energy and innocence. A soft smile touched her lips as she watched them chase each other around, their laughter ringing out like a joyful melody. She noticed little Marcus, a boy who'd just started school and who often came to her door for an extra cookie, looking up and waving. "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins," he called up, his little voice full of warmth. "Good morning, Marcus," Mabel waved back. "Stay out of trouble now." As she turned back into her apartment, she heard a familiar knock on the door. She opened it to see her nephew Kevin, his face lighting up as soon as he saw her. He was tall and lean, in his early 20s, with a sharp mind and a drive that often reminded her of herself in her younger days. "Aunt Mabel," he greeted her, pulling her into a gentle hug. Kevin visited her regularly, both to keep her company and to make sure she was doing well. Today, he brought her a bag of groceries and a small bouquet of flowers, which she gratefully accepted. "Why, thank you, sweetheart," she said, beaming up at him. "You're spoiling me. You know that?" Kevin chuckled, setting the groceries on the counter. "I think you deserve it. How's everything around here?" "Oh, you know, the usual," Mabel replied with a sigh. "Just trying to keep these old bones moving, and keeping an eye on the neighborhood kids, too." Kevin nodded, his expression growing more serious. "I know you care about this community a lot, Aunt Mabel. That's why I worry about you sometimes." She looked up at him, sensing the tension behind his words. Kevin had always been outspoken, especially about social justice issues, and she knew that he had a strong distrust of the police. It wasn't hard to see why. He'd seen too many cases of young black men being unfairly targeted, too many lives disrupted by a system that didn't seem to protect everyone equally. "I know you're always talking about this neighborhood like it's safe," Kevin said carefully, "but there are still things that worry me. The police here, they're not always fair, you know. I just want you to be careful." Mabel reached out and patted his hand. "I appreciate your concern, Kevin, I really do. But I've lived here a long time. I know these streets, and I know most of the people in this neighborhood, police included. Things may not be perfect, but it's not as bad as all that." Kevin looked down, a crease forming between his brows. "Maybe. But just because they're polite to you doesn't mean they're not doing harm to others. I know you want to believe the best in everyone, but not everyone has a kind heart like you." She let out a soft chuckle. "Well, maybe that's true, but kindness has to start somewhere, right? You can't change the world by shutting people out." Kevin shifted, looking almost frustrated. "Aunt Mabel, I get it, but I've seen what happens when you trust the wrong people. The world isn't like it used to be." There was a long pause as Mabel considered his words. She understood his frustration, even if she didn't fully share it. Kevin had grown up in a different world than she had, a world that felt colder, where people seemed more divided, and where fear seemed to dictate so many actions. Finally, she gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "I know you're trying to protect me, Kevin, and I appreciate that. But I've seen enough of life to know that fear won't solve anything. If we let it rule us, then we've already lost." Kevin sighed, looking as if he wanted to argue but didn't have the heart to contradict her. He gave her a small, reluctant smile. "Well, maybe I worry too much," he admitted, "but I just don't want anything to happen to you." Mabel smiled back, patting his shoulder. "I'm tougher than I look, sweetheart. Besides, I've got you looking out for me." Kevin couldn't help but laugh at that. "I guess so," he said, his tone softening. "But promise me you'll call me if anything happens, all right?" "I promise," Mabel replied with a nod. "But you don't have to worry. This old lady still has plenty of life in her." As they shared a laugh, the tension eased, and Kevin looked more at ease. He stayed a while longer, helping her put away the groceries and catching her up on his own life. He told her about his classes, his friends, and his plans to organize a community meeting about police reform. She listened with pride, happy to see him so passionate about making a difference. When he finally left, Mabel walked him to the door and watched him go, feeling a familiar warmth in her heart. She knew that Kevin meant well, that his desire to protect her came from a place of love, and while she didn't share all of his fears, she couldn't help but feel grateful for his concern. As the door closed behind him, Mabel sat back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the photos on the wall, pictures of her husband, her children, and, of course, Kevin as a little boy. She remembered the days when he would sit on her lap, his eyes wide with wonder as she told him stories about the world. He'd always been a fighter, even then, always questioning, always searching for answers. But the world was different now. That much she couldn't deny. The morning air was crisp with the gentle hum of life stirring in the neighborhood. Mabel Jenkins adjusted her scarf and double-checked her purse, preparing herself for her regular trip to the corner store. It was one of her favorite routines, a little walk, some fresh air, and a chance to see familiar faces. She had lived here long enough to know almost everyone by name, and they all knew her as Miss Mabel, the lady with a warm smile who always had a kind word for everyone. Today, she was joined by two neighborhood kids, Maya and Jackson, who had eagerly offered to help her with her shopping bags. They looked up to Mabel, who often told them stories of the old days, making them feel connected to a world that existed long before they were born. "All set, Miss Mabel?" Jackson asked, beaming up at her. Mabel smiled, patting his shoulder. "I think so, Jackson. And thank you two for coming along. My knees aren't what they used to be, you know." Maya, a little girl with bouncing braids, held Mabel's hand as they walked toward the corner. "I like coming with you, Miss Mabel," she said. "You tell the best stories." "Well, I'll be sure to tell you one on the way back," Mabel promised, her voice warm and affectionate. As they approached the crosswalk, Mabel glanced up, noting the traffic light turning green for pedestrians. She started across with careful, measured steps, Maya and Jackson by her side. They were in the middle of the crosswalk, talking and laughing, when Mabel heard the low hum of an approaching engine. The police car appeared at the corner, accelerating as it neared the crosswalk. Mabel, trusting the light, continued to walk slowly, expecting the driver to yield. But as the car sped closer, she realized with a start that it wasn't slowing down. Her heart thumped, and she instinctively tightened her grip on Maya's hand. The car screeched closer, its roar shattering the stillness of the street. Mabel's gaze met the driver's through the windshield, a young white officer with a cold, indifferent look in his eyes. She could see he was talking into his radio, one hand on the wheel, his gaze momentarily focused on her, yet showing no sign of slowing. "Wait, Miss Mabel." Jackson's voice was high and panicked as he tugged on her arm. It was too late. The car struck Mabel, and she felt a flash of pain before she fell, her body collapsing onto the asphalt with a jolt that stole her breath. The world spun around her as she lay there, her vision blurred, her senses a chaotic jumble of sounds and colors. She heard Maya screaming, felt hands grabbing at her, but the pain was all-encompassing, pulling her into darkness. The driver finally stopped, stepping out of the car, but he didn't rush to her side. He looked at her sprawled figure with something like annoyance, as though this were an inconvenience to him. People began to gather, shouting and pointing, their voices a loud murmur of disbelief and anger. "Miss Mabel?" Maya's little hands were clutching her arm, and Mabel fought to open her eyes to reassure the terrified child. "Don't cry, honey," she managed, her voice weak and shaky, but the pain was overwhelming, and Mabel could feel herself slipping. She heard someone call for an ambulance, someone else shouting at the officer, accusing him of carelessness, of recklessness. She wanted to tell them to be kind, to keep calm, but the darkness pressed in and the world faded. Kevin rushed through the sterile hallways of the hospital, his heart racing as he searched for the room number the nurse had given him. His mind was a chaotic storm of fear and fury. When he'd received the call, he'd thought it was some kind of mistake. His Aunt Mabel? Hit by a police car? The words didn't even make sense to him. Finally, he found her room and pushed the door open. His aunt lay in the bed, her face pale and bruised, her eyes closed. Tubes and wires connected her to the machines that beeped softly around her, keeping a steady rhythm in the quiet room. The sight of her like this, so small and fragile, struck him like a punch to the gut. "Aunt Mabel," he whispered, stepping closer. A nurse entered, her expression sympathetic. "Are you family?" she asked softly. Kevin nodded, unable to tear his eyes from Mabel. "Her nephew. How is she?" The nurse hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She's stable, but she suffered some serious injuries. We're keeping her in a medically induced coma for now to help her heal. It will be a long recovery, I'm afraid." Kevin's fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't believe this was happening. His aunt, the woman who'd been his rock, who'd given so much of herself to this neighborhood, reduced to this state by some careless cop who couldn't be bothered to slow down at a crosswalk. Anger simmered beneath his shock, a fire that burned hotter with every second he looked at her fragile form. "Who did this?" he demanded, turning to the nurse. Her expression darkened. "The police are handling it as an internal matter. The officer involved claimed it was an accident." "An accident?" Kevin's voice was bitter. "My aunt is lying here because he didn't bother to stop. How is that an accident?" The nurse's gaze softened. "I'm sorry, sir. I know this is hard to accept, but right now it's best if you focus on being here for her. She's going to need her family." Kevin nodded numbly, but his mind was already racing. He wouldn't just sit by and let them sweep this under the rug. His aunt deserved better than that. Word of the accident spread quickly. By the next morning, the story was all over the neighborhood. People gathered in small groups, talking in low voices, their faces clouded with anger and worry. Mabel Jenkins was a beloved figure, and the fact that a police officer had hit her in broad daylight sent shockwaves through the community. Kevin returned to the neighborhood that evening, exhausted and angry, but determined. He visited the spot where it had happened, looking at the crosswalk as if it might hold some answers. He could almost see his aunt there, moving slowly, trusting the light, completely unaware of the danger speeding toward her. Several neighbors approached him, offering their sympathy and support. One of them, Mr. Robinson, a retired schoolteacher, placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder. "We're all here for you, son," he said. "If there's anything we can do." Kevin nodded, grateful for the support. "I appreciate it, but I'm not going to let this go. My aunt, she didn't deserve this, and I'm going to make sure the people responsible don't get away with it." One of the kids who had been with Mabel that day, Maya, came forward hesitantly. She looked up at Kevin, her face pale and serious. "I saw it, Mr. Kevin," she said in a small voice. "The officer, he was going really fast. He didn't even try to stop." Kevin knelt down to her level, his heart breaking at the fear in her young eyes. "Thank you for telling me, Maya. I know this must be hard for you." She nodded, looking down at her shoes. "I just wanted to help Miss Mabel. She always helped me." Kevin swallowed the lump in his throat, reaching out to pat her shoulder. "You did the right thing, Maya, and I promise we're going to get justice for her." That night, Kevin sat alone in his aunt's apartment, surrounded by the familiar things that filled her world. Photos of family and friends lined the walls, her knitting needles lay on the table beside her favorite chair, and the smell of her lavender hand cream lingered in the air. He looked at a picture of the two of them, taken a few years ago at a family gathering. His aunt was smiling, her arm around his shoulders, looking as if nothing could ever shake her faith in the goodness of the world. Kevin's jaw clenched. He couldn't bring himself to sit back and wait for the system to work. He knew that without pressure, without people demanding accountability, this would be written off as an unfortunate accident. But he couldn't let that happen. Not to Mabel. Not to the woman who'd been a mother to him, who'd taught him kindness and courage and the importance of standing up for what was right. With renewed determination, he grabbed his phone and began making calls. First to friends, then to local activists he knew. He shared what happened to his aunt and the officer's lack of care. He posted on social media, recounting the incident and calling for justice, for accountability, for the truth to be known. Within hours, his post had gained traction, people from all around the neighborhood sharing their outrage. Support flooded in, neighbors offering their help, others promising to attend any rallies or gatherings he might organize. Kevin felt a spark of hope amidst his grief and fury. If the system wouldn't fight for Mabel, then he would. Kevin's post on social media was like a spark in a dry field, igniting outrage and support that spread quickly across the community. Friends, family, and even strangers shared it, their comments full of anger and solidarity. They spoke of Mabel as the kind-hearted woman who'd been a mother figure to so many and a pillar of their neighborhood. Her accident was a tragedy, but the details surrounding it made it more than that. It was a wrong that demanded to be righted. Determined to keep up the pressure, Kevin took to the streets speaking with neighbors and gathering witnesses. The children who had been with Mabel that day repeated their accounts, each one more heartbreaking than the last. They described how the officer had ignored her presence, how he hadn't even tried to slow down. Kevin listened, anger simmering as he took note of every detail they could remember. Mabel's accident became the talk of the neighborhood, and soon after, local news stations picked up the story. Journalists began to visit, asking questions, interviewing neighbors, and capturing the outpouring of grief and anger that filled the community. Kevin found himself in front of cameras, speaking passionately about his aunt, her kindness, and the injustice of her being reduced to a casualty of careless authority. "I just want accountability," he told the cameras one afternoon, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "My aunt didn't deserve this. No one deserves to be treated like their life doesn't matter." The police, feeling the heat, finally issued a statement, calling the accident a tragic oversight and promising a thorough investigation. But Kevin and the rest of the community were wary. They'd heard promises like this before. It wasn't lost on them that the officer involved, Kyle Taylor, had a history of complaints, many involving his treatment of black residents, complaints that had never led to any real consequences. Kevin decided he couldn't let the investigation be left entirely in the hands of the police. He reached out to local activists asking for advice on how to proceed, and they offered to help with organizing a community meeting. He spent hours going through witness statements, photographs, and gathering every piece of evidence he could find. His focus became laser sharp. This was no longer just about his aunt. It was about every person in his community who felt they were powerless to fight back. The community meeting was packed. Hundreds of people gathered in the local recreation center, filling the seats and lining the walls, all there to demand answers. Kevin spoke first, recounting the events as they had been relayed to him by witnesses, detailing the negligence and the officer's disregard for Mabel's safety. His voice rang out with conviction, and he could see the anger mirrored in the faces around him. One by one, people stood up to speak. A young man who had once been stopped by Officer Taylor without cause shared his story. An elderly woman spoke of the fear she felt whenever she saw police cars in the area. Parents, teachers, and local business owners all took turns, each story painting a damning picture of a system that seemed indifferent to their lives and their well-being. When Kevin took the microphone again, he called for something more than just an investigation. He demanded justice, not just for Mabel, but for everyone who had been treated as if they didn't matter. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing through the hall as they chanted her name, making it clear they would not be silent. The next day, the police department announced they would conduct an internal investigation. But Kevin knew better than to trust their word. He contacted a lawyer, someone recommended by a friend who specialized in civil rights cases. They discussed strategies, going over the details of Mabel's case and weighing the options for pushing forward. The lawyer advised Kevin to gather as many public witnesses as possible and to look for any video evidence that might support their claims. Kevin spent the following days reaching out to people who had been at the scene, asking if anyone had managed to capture footage. Finally, after days of searching, he struck gold. A young woman had filmed the entire incident from her car, showing Officer Taylor's disregard for the crosswalk and his indifference after the collision. With this evidence in hand, Kevin and his lawyer went public, releasing the footage to local news channels. The video went viral, sparking outrage far beyond their neighborhood. Commentators, activists, and community leaders all condemned the actions shown in the video, calling for the officer's immediate suspension, calls for justice reverberated on social media, where people across the city expressed their disbelief and anger. Under mounting pressure, the police department had no choice but to act. Officer Taylor was placed on temporary leave while the investigation continued, but the community wasn't satisfied with this token gesture. Kevin, who had by now become the face of their fight, continued to organize rallies and marches, refusing to let the department quietly brush the matter aside. As the days passed, Kevin grew both exhausted and determined. The long hours, the constant meetings, and the emotional toll of his aunt's condition weighed on him, but he couldn't afford to stop. Every time he felt his resolve falter, he reminded himself of Mabel, of her kindness, her strength, and the unwavering belief in justice she had instilled in him. He had to do this for her, for all she had done for him and the people she loved. At the next rally, Kevin stood in front of a crowd that had swelled with supporters from across the city. He spoke of his aunt, of how she had been the heart of their community, and of how her kindness had touched everyone who knew her. He spoke of the officer's negligence, the department's attempts to downplay the incident, and the urgent need for change. The crowd's response was overwhelming. As he finished speaking, they surged forward, chanting her name, filling the streets with their voices. It was a powerful sight, a testament to the strength of their community and the love they felt for Mabel. Kevin knew the battle was far from over, but in that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. The rally for Mabel had created an undeniable wave. News channels began digging deeper into the incident, broadcasting footage of the crowd demanding justice and sharing the heart-wrenching stories of Mabel's impact on her neighborhood. People were finally listening, but it wasn't just the public taking notice. Law enforcement and city officials under scrutiny had initiated their own investigation into Officer Kyle Taylor's record. The community wanted to believe the system would respond fairly, but there was skepticism. They had seen too many cases before where investigations had only served to protect those in power. Kevin, however, was relentless. He spent every spare moment pushing the investigation forward, working with journalists and his lawyer to ensure no detail was missed. Together, they began to uncover a disturbing picture, one that added fuel to an already roaring fire. The officer responsible for Mabel's injuries, Kyle Taylor, was far from an ordinary cop. He had joined the force straight out of college and quickly developed a reputation for his aggressive tactics, particularly with people of color. His record revealed years of misconduct complaints, unnecessary stops, rude comments, and intimidation tactics. And while these complaints were filed, none had led to disciplinary action. In every case, Taylor had been given the benefit of the doubt, a dismissal, or a minor reprimand that allowed him to continue without consequence. Kevin's lawyer, Martin, urged him to dig deeper. If we can show a pattern of abuse, we can build a case that this wasn't just an isolated incident. The system enabled him to keep hurting people. Determined, Kevin tracked down people in the neighborhood who had previous encounters with Taylor. Some were hesitant, still wary of retaliation, but others stepped forward, recounting stories of humiliation, harassment, and fear. A few even had evidence, photos and videos from their phones documenting Taylor's unjust actions. Each story painted a damning portrait of an officer who had used his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. Among those who stepped forward was an elderly man named Mr. Bryant, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than most. Bryant's encounter with Officer Taylor had left a lasting scar, both physical and emotional. He described a night when he had been stopped without cause, forced out of his car and thrown to the ground. Taylor's reasoning, Bryant, fit the description. The fact that the suspect was a younger man, decades younger than Mr. Bryant, hadn't seemed to matter. His complaints, like so many others, had gone nowhere. The worst part, Mr. Bryant said, his voice shaken with age and emotion, was knowing that they wouldn't believe me even if I told them. People like him think they're untouchable. With each story Kevin gathered, his anger deepened. He felt as if he were hearing the same story repeated over and over, each encounter another reminder of the institutional bias that protected men like Taylor. It wasn't just about his aunt anymore. This was a fight for everyone who had suffered under a system that was supposed to protect them. Kevin organized another rally, inviting those who had stepped forward to speak publicly. He wanted the world to hear their stories, to see their faces, to understand that this wasn't just one family's tragedy, but a long-standing pattern of abuse that affected the whole community. The rally was powerful, with neighbors sharing their stories of intimidation and harassment at the hands of Officer Taylor. The audience listened, moved by the pain and resilience of those who had come forward, and as Kevin took the stage, he felt the weight of their stories pressing on him, each one a reminder of the responsibility he now carried. "This is not just about Mabel," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about everyone who has been ignored, silenced, and made to feel less than human. It's about a system that needs to change." The rally made headlines, and soon, even national media began covering the story. Journalists from around the country called, wanting to understand how an officer with so many complaints had remained on the force for so long. Kevin's phone was constantly ringing, his email overflowing with messages from activists, lawyers, and reporters offering help or asking for interviews. He was tired, overwhelmed, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Then a breakthrough came. A local journalist, inspired by Kevin's story, dug into police records and found a video from a traffic camera near the site of Mabel's accident. The footage showed Officer Taylor approaching the crosswalk and clearly saw Mabel before he sped up instead of slowing down. The journalist shared the footage with Kevin and his lawyer, and together they made the decision to release it to the public. The video spread like wildfire. In it, Taylor's disregard for Mabel's safety was undeniable. Public outrage grew, with citizens demanding Taylor's immediate dismissal. Protesters took to the streets, their voices echoing through the city as they chanted for justice. And yet, the police department still hesitated, citing the ongoing investigation as a reason for delaying action. Frustrated, Kevin and his lawyer decided it was time to take legal action. With the mounting evidence, they filed a civil lawsuit against Officer Taylor and the police department, charging them with negligence, misconduct, and failure to act on previous complaints. It was a bold move, one that would require extensive time and resources, but Kevin knew it was necessary. The community rallied around Kevin, donating money to cover legal expenses and offering whatever support they could. Local businesses put up signs that read, "Justice for Mabel" and "End Police Bias." Mabel's story had become a rallying cry, uniting people in a way Kevin hadn't imagined possible. As the case moved forward, Kevin reflected on everything that had happened since that terrible day at the crosswalk. He'd started this journey seeking justice for his aunt, but it had grown into something so much bigger. He was fighting for every person who had ever been hurt, ignored, or silenced. He was fighting for a future where no one would have to live in fear of those meant to protect them. And though he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, he was ready for the challenge. The courtroom was packed. People filled every seat, while others crowded near the doors, hoping to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. The air buzzed with anticipation and tension. Kevin sat near the front, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his heart pounding as he waited for the trial to begin. This was the moment he and his community had been fighting for, a chance to finally confront Officer Taylor and the police department, to force them to answer for what had happened to Mabel and countless others. Over the past weeks, Kevin had spoken with more people who had suffered at Taylor's hands, each story a painful reminder of the abuse of power that had plagued their neighborhood for years. The judge entered, and everyone stood. As the trial began, Kevin's lawyer, Martin, rose to make the opening statement. Martin was known for his eloquence, and his voice was steady as he addressed the jury, speaking of Mabel's kindness, her deep roots in the community, and the tragic, unnecessary accident that had left her fighting for her life. She was a mother, a grandmother, a friend, Martin said, looking each juror in the eye. But to Officer Taylor, she was just an obstacle, something to be disregarded. And today, we're here to prove that this was no accident. It was a result of negligence, prejudice, and a failure to treat a human life with the respect it deserves. As Martin spoke, Kevin felt a surge of gratitude and determination. He knew they were in capable hands, and as the trial continued, he listened intently, his heart breaking each time a witness took the stand to recount their encounters with Taylor. One of the first to testify was Mr. Bryant, the elderly man who had been roughly handled by Taylor during a stop years earlier. Bryant's voice was quiet, his gaze steady as he described the humiliation he had felt, the sense of powerlessness that had stayed with him long after the encounter. "I was treated like a criminal," Bryant said, his voice trembling slightly, "just because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he never apologized, not once." Another witness was Maya, the young girl who had been with Mabel at the Crosswalk that day. She spoke in a small, shaky voice, describing how Officer Taylor had sped toward them without slowing down. Her innocence, her simple recounting of the events, left many in the audience dabbing at their eyes. "It was like he didn't see her," Maya said, looking at her hands, "or like he didn't care." Kevin's heart ached as he watched Maya leave the stand, her small shoulders drooping under the weight of her memories. She was too young to be here, too young to bear witness to such cruelty, but her testimony, like Bryant's, was a powerful reminder of the impact that Taylor's actions had had on the community. Then came the turn of Officer Taylor's defense. His lawyer painted him as a hard-working officer with a spotless record, someone who had made a mistake in a high-stress situation. Taylor sat there, stone-faced, occasionally glancing at the jury but never meeting the eyes of those he had wronged. The defense tried to argue that Mabel had stepped into the crosswalk unexpectedly, that Taylor hadn't had time to react. But the video evidence showed otherwise. The footage, which had been played earlier in the trial, clearly showed Taylor accelerating as he approached Mabel, a damning piece of evidence that no one could ignore. In the days that followed, more witnesses testified, each adding weight to the case against Taylor. Community members recounted incidents where Taylor had acted aggressively or dismissively, particularly toward people of color. Some were stopped without cause, others verbally harassed, and each story further highlighted the pattern of abuse that had been ignored for too long. Finally, the day came for Kevin to take the stand. He had prepared for this moment, going over his words again and again, but now, standing in front of the jury, he felt a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he began. "My aunt, Mabel Jenkins, is a good woman," he said, his voice strong. She's the heart of our community. She's the one who takes care of everyone, who brings us together. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to be left on the street, broken and forgotten, because someone couldn't be bothered to stop. He glanced at Officer Taylor, who sat impassively, his face betraying no hint of remorse. Kevin continued, his voice filled with the pain and anger that had driven him to this point. This isn't just about my aunt. This is about every person in our community who has felt afraid, who has been treated like they don't matter. This is about justice. And we're here today because we won't be silent anymore. The room was silent as Kevin finished, his words hanging heavy in the air. He stepped down, feeling the weight of his community's hope on his shoulders, and took his seat, his gaze steady. The defense made its closing arguments, insisting that Taylor was simply a man doing his job, that he hadn't intended to cause harm. But the jury's faces remained impassive, their expressions unreadable as they listened to the lawyer's pleas. Finally, it was time for the jury to deliberate. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as everyone waited, each person holding their breath, each one hoping that justice would finally be served. After hours that felt like an eternity, the jury returned, their faces solemn. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper with the verdict. Kevin's heart pounded as he waited, every fiber of his being focused on the words that would follow. We find the defendant, Officer Kyle Taylor, guilty of gross negligence. The room erupted. Cheers, sobs, and cries of relief filled the air as people hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Kevin felt a wave of emotion crash over him, a mixture of joy, relief, and the knowledge that his aunt's suffering had not been in vain. The judge's gavel brought the room back to order, and the sentence was handed down, a suspension, followed by a dismissal from the force, with Taylor stripped of his badge. It was a victory, not just for Mabel, but for everyone who had suffered in silence for so long. As the courtroom emptied, Kevin found himself surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. They clapped him on the back, hugged him, and thanked him for fighting for justice. And though he knew the road ahead would still be challenging, he felt a deep sense of peace. The news of the verdict had spread quickly. Across the city, headlines read, "Justice for Mabel Jenkins, officer found guilty of negligence." People shared the news online, discussing the trial and expressing relief, hope, and a renewed faith in the possibility of change. For Kevin, the victory felt monumental, but as he left the courtroom, he knew this was only the beginning. Mabel had finally regained consciousness a few days before the verdict, and though she was still weak, she was recovering. She hadn't yet been told about the full extent of the trial, but as Kevin entered her hospital room, he was ready to share the good news. "Aunt Mabel," he whispered, leaning close to her as she opened her eyes, a gentle smile forming on her face. "Kevin, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice faint but warm. "It's good to see you." He sat by her side, holding her hand. "You're going to be all right, Aunt Mabel. I've got good news." She looked at him, her eyes filled with the kindness and strength that had carried her through so much. "What is it?" "The officer who hurt you, he's been held accountable. The court found him guilty," Kevin said, feeling a surge of pride and relief as he spoke. Mabel's gaze softened, and she reached up to pat his hand. "Oh, Kevin, I'm glad justice was done, but I hope he learned something from all this, too. Maybe it'll make him a better man." Kevin was silent for a moment, moved by her compassion. Even after everything she'd been through, Mabel's heart remained full of forgiveness and hope. It was one of the things he admired most about her. "Maybe it will," he said gently. "But we didn't just fight for you, Aunt Mabel. We fought for everyone in this community." Mabel's smile widened and she nodded. "Good. I always knew you'd grow up to do something important, Kevin. I just didn't know it'd be this." They sat together in peaceful silence, Mabel's hand resting in his, a feeling of calm settling over them. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of healing in that room, a promise that the future could be brighter. Over the next few weeks, the city was alive with talk of change. Inspired by Mabel's case, local leaders and activists called for broader reforms in the police department, aiming to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Community meetings were organized to discuss the steps needed to improve accountability, transparency, and training among officers. Kevin attended every meeting, sometimes as a speaker, sometimes as a listener. He wanted to make sure that Mabel's story was never forgotten, that her suffering would pave the way for a safer, fairer system. He worked tirelessly, speaking with lawyers, community leaders, and even city officials, all of whom were now open to discussing necessary reforms. One evening, Kevin sat with his lawyer Martin and a few key community members to outline a plan. They proposed the establishment of a civilian oversight committee, a group of residents who would review complaints against the police and ensure they were handled fairly and transparently. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and soon it gained enough momentum to reach the city council. With the city now under public pressure and scrutiny, the council finally agreed to hear their proposal. On the day of the council meeting, Kevin and Martin presented their case. Kevin spoke passionately, recounting the impact of his aunt's accident, the stories of those who had come forward, and the urgent need for reform. He reminded them that this was about more than justice for Mabel. It was about creating a future where no one would have to experience the same pain. By the end of the meeting, the council had agreed to pilot the Civilian Oversight Committee. It was a small victory, but it was a significant step toward real, lasting change. As Mabel recovered, Kevin and the community worked to rebuild what had been broken, not just for her, but for all the victims of past injustices. Neighbors came together to support the families who had been affected, offering help and compassion in a way that brought new strength to their bonds. Mabel, once she was strong enough to leave the hospital, returned home to find her apartment filled with flowers, cards, and warm meals prepared by her friends and neighbors. One afternoon, Kevin organized a gathering in the community center, a celebration of Mabel's return and a tribute to the resilience of everyone who had come together to make a difference. Mabel sat in the center of the room, surrounded by loved ones, her face glowing with gratitude as she listened to the words of appreciation and love. Kevin stood before the crowd, his heart full as he looked at the faces around him. "Thank you all for standing with us," he began. "Thank you for being there when we needed you. Because of you, we showed that our voices matter, that our lives matter, and we've taken the first step toward a better future." The room erupted in applause, and Kevin felt a warmth settle over him. This was more than he'd hoped for, not just justice for his aunt, but a united community, a newfound strength that would carry them forward. A few weeks later, Kevin took Mabel to a quiet spot in the neighborhood park where they could sit together and talk. She was still recovering, but her spirit was as bright as ever. "Kevin," she said softly, looking out over the park, "I always hoped you'd find your path, and I think you've found it now." He looked at her, understanding what she meant. The fight for justice, for accountability, had become his mission, a cause he couldn't abandon, not after seeing the difference it could make. "You're right, Aunt Mabel," he said, taking her hand. "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Together, they sat in the peace of the park, their hearts full of hope. Kevin knew the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and setbacks, but he also knew he wouldn't be walking it alone. He had his community, his family, and a purpose that would guide him forward. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm light over the park, Kevin felt a sense of belonging, of hope, and the knowledge that he was right where he was meant to be, fighting for a better, more just world, one step at a time. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and check out the other videos on the channel. There's more to come. Share this video with your friends so more people will know about these stories.